Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love, Shamika Michelle, and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love alongside my co-hosts Shamika Michelle and Wilfred Riley. And our guest this week is Matt Rosenberg. He is a senior editor at Wirepoints, a Illinois and Chicago-based nonprofit news organization. He is the author of the book, What Next, Chicago? Notes of a Pissed Off Native Son, and a journalist and a great writer of prose. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Charles. I'm pleased to be with all of you.
Well, it's great to have you. We've been talking to people about before and after the crazy summer of 2020, where you were, it's like, the moon landing and 9/11. Everybody's like, where were you the day the music, George Floyd died and everything went to crap. And you have a unique perspective. We've had Liz Collin come on and talk about Minneapolis, which was kind of ground zero from that respect. And David Marcus talk about New York. And everybody knows there was craziness going on in Seattle, but you have a unique take because you were in Seattle at the time of the good old Chop Chas, whichever one you like to roll with. But also you are originally spent a lot of time in Chicago. You saw what was happening there with the riots and you wanted to kind of do some investigative reporting. So you went there from Seattle to kind of, anchor yourself and write about all of this chaos in Chicago. So you have the perspective of both cities. So I wanted to have you on and talk about that. So can you start off by talking a bit about, a little bit of your Chicago background, but also your time in Seattle when everything was a little more tranquil.
A little more tranquil, but not so much. My wife and I moved to Seattle in 1994 from Chicago. I grew up here, lived here for 30 years. And it was very tranquil until about 1999. And that was when the World Trade Organization riots in the streets started at the ministerial conference. And I posit that was really the beginning of something in Seattle that carried to the east and down the coast. I believe that the source code of modern day American urban political anarchy was really written in Seattle. What followed after 1999, 2001, seemingly innocent Mardi Gras celebration, women being sexually assaulted, revelers being attacked by roving gang members, Good Samaritan killed a 20-year-old man after someone cracked a bottle on his head when he was bending down to help a woman who'd been assaulted. Then the May Day protests, especially 2012 through 2016. Before that, 2009, the beginning of targeted killings of police. A man named Christopher Monfort, and he had been studying jury nullification at the University of Washington and believed that, had strong feelings about systemic racism and criminal justice, which fine, do your research, write your papers, make your arguments, no question, but to go target cops because of that. Then there were some other police killings. So a lot of stuff started to go bad in Seattle in the 2000s. And then, of course, 2020. So I was back there. I saw Chicago starting to blow up, and that eventually drew me back here to work on my book. But we had a whole sequence of things happen in Seattle in 2020 that you're all familiar with, especially where the mayor and the city council, because they wanted political cover, I think, and needed to be down with the activists who were up in arms after George Floyd. They basically hectored their Black female police chief, into resigning. They cut her salary first by 6 figures. Then they tried to walk that back a tiny bit. And then, of course, they gave away a police station. The one of only 5 precinct headquarters in the city, the East Precinct in Capitol Hill, which is a very warm and fuzzy activist neighborhood, a cool neighborhood. I like it. But that happened. And then the mayor, Jenny Durkin, famously said, oh, well, it'll be like the summer of love. Didn't quite work out that way.
Wow. So that's a nice introduction on the Seattle end. Obviously, we'll get to Chicago, but any comments on that, Shamika?
No, I don't really have a lot of comments. I just really want to know more about how it was. I mean, of course, I saw it on the news, or really mostly on social media, people talking about it. The news seemed to kind of cover it up. But I just kind of want to know more about how it really was and what was taking place and going on at that time.
Like on the ground in Chaz and all
Yes.
that, outside of that? Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll give you a good point. I'll give you a couple of examples. Well, for one thing, I think there were, was it 2, 3, or 4 people killed in the encampment? So the encampment, which everyone was picturing as a place with vegan cuisine and poetry slams, and hard folk music being played into the wee hours. It got funky real fast. And interestingly, with the police barred from the zone, the occupied zone, the progressives were not able to police themselves. And when certain people were seriously injured, emergency personnel were blocked from coming in. So it turned violent and chaotic. That was one thing that was going on. Part and parcel of that, I'll tell you a super quick anecdote. The highways were blocked off in downtown. Now, Interstate 5, right, is our huge north-south interstate highway on the West Coast, goes from like Tijuana to Vancouver, and it runs right through downtown Seattle. And it was often shut down at night during that whole summer of love, because people just decided they could take not only the streets, not only the police precinct, they could take the highway. And so they would go out there to protest one thing or another. It wasn't always, George Floyd related. And of course, that's the thing sometimes about the left, it turns into a kind of a cluster type arrangement. One night I was driving back from the Olympic Peninsula, where I go out to do long day hikes. It's very beautiful out there, and it still is. And I noticed a sign saying, when you get to Seattle, you should know I-5 will be closed. And because of what I knew right away, I knew what was going on. I knew once again the protesters had shut down I-5. And so, first world problem, maybe, yeah, but, we're seeing this in Chicago now, when streets are appropriated illegally by not just drag racers, but guys doing this thing called spinning, which is a whole nother story. But we had a triple homicide at one of these spinning events recently. And when police have come to these stunt driving exhibitions, their windshields have been smashed repeatedly. So this whole idea of appropriating public infrastructure that is meant for a clear purpose, of moving vehicles and appropriating it without authorization, that to me in some ways sort of encapsulates one part of this whole thing we're experiencing, this modern day anarchy that was unleashed. Righteous anger after George Floyd, no question about it, right? But then that served as a springboard for this sort of anarchy that's, is still with us. And so, this really goes to what's going on in our cities today, whether Chicago, Seattle, Philadelphia, New York, LA, San Francisco, you name it, New Orleans.
Well, I want to get Will's take here, and just Matt, so just a point of interest. The president of CHOP is one of Will's buddies.
Oh, really? Tell me more about that.
All right, yeah. So if we're segueing to me, I mean, there are a couple different things here. First of all, yeah, not we're not friends, but I do know Roz Simone in passing, before different podcasts and so on, like
Yeah.
the Warlord in Chaz. And my
Right.
understanding of the place was that it wasn't like a nice little scene at all. What you had was a weird coalition between like white hard radicals, like
Mhm.
Eugene anarchist types, and black gangbangers, basically. And they were both strapped up enough that they got along well with each other, but they were running the area, and those groups combined were extorting small businessmen, so on down the line. And in kind of
Yes.
street culture, like members of both have talked about this to like the Source magazine and so on. This was extremely well known. So that was the dark side of kind of Chaz Chop. Like you might go there during the day and watch like the hippie girls dance, but if you stayed at night, you were very likely to get robbed or carjacked. I mean, there were people patrolling the border with, Armalite rifles and so on. It's a weird scene. My comment on that actually is that that's not a first world problem at all. It's a third world problem. And as a leader, you have to completely break that kind of thing. Like if you have some moral objection to hurting or killing people that are trying to hurt or kill you, which I consider weird prey behavior, but if you do, just think about all the innocent citizens of that area that you're protecting or whatever. But you just can't. You see this in San Francisco as well. You just can't have homeless encampments full of young warrior class men located in the middle of your city, because shit's not going to work. Those people are just going to take whatever they want from the citizens. And I mean, like when I was in the third world, like for example, doing something basic like an American Field Service trip to Costa Rica. If you're thinking about going to Nicaragua or El Sal, the surrounding countries, I mean, people have to be sent out to kind of reconnoiter and see whether it's safe. And they'll say shit like what you just described, like, nope, they're bandits on the highway. There are people protesting the oppression of Indians, and they're burning tires on the highway, and they're sitting there with guns and machetes. So you can't take the Grand Trunk Road down through Central America. You're going to have to detour or take these 20-mile-an-hour buses or something like that. So when you hear this in American cities, I mean, you understand that there's a thin veneer of civilization over savagery. Like you as the mayor absolutely have to put a stop to that. You have to send, frankly, jackbooted cops in and tear down the encampment. And when they actually did that, it took like a week. There wasn't much fighting. It was just people moved and the place shut down and the road started working again. So yeah, I have no sympathy for that at all. As a leader, which I probably will be at some point in my life, I would totally and utterly break it. And also, yes, I do know Roz Simone, who's a cool guy. I mean, but just, and that again gets into just sort of sheer amorality. Like if I was 20 and someone was like, hey, there are a lot of idiots in this city that'll let you take over 15 square miles, become a warlord, sleep with 100 women and steal $100,000. Would you do it? I mean, yeah, but that there has to be someone to check that and to say, no, that's not possible. And last comment, I do think when we look at the giant left-wing riots that erupted a little further down the road, and then for that matter, when we look at, not to excuse the right, but January 6th or Kenosha left and right shooting it out in the streets, I think that the reason people thought they could get away with that shit, like we'll show up with our team of 100 and they'll bring their team of 100 while a gun battle, like this is Panama City, was that we'd seen this stuff. We'd seen cities on television on fire and no one doing anything. And the question was, why not? Well, why not take it to the next level? So Seattle, where you were, was one of the first places, a big port city, often a launch pad for new trends, by the way, going back to grunge. But I mean, was one of the places where people first saw that. World Trade Riot, Chaz Chop, Capitol Hill. They're not doing anything.
No, and you mentioned people from Eugene, Oregon, and they were central to the 1999 riots downtown when the police finally had to come out with rubber bullets. So the Eugene Black Bloc, as they called themselves, their influence was felt throughout the first decade of the new century as well. And they set a tone. Yeah.
Well, we'll make some good points. So let's get to that for a minute before we move to Chicago. Leadership. So
yes,
we can talk about what they should have done in the face of that and how they were feckless, which they were. But there's another facet to it. You mentioned the mayor, the Summer of Love. She wasn't the only one that was, not just not doing their job and protecting the masses of citizens who needed protection. that were leaning into what they were doing, right? We talked to Liz Collin a couple of weeks ago, and the mayor of Minneapolis was like, tell us what you want. I'll give you whatever you want, right? Some of them, remember, was it Baltimore's mayor that said, give them some space? You know, you
Room
had
to destroy,
DC,
yeah.
you had all these, so you had these people who were in positions of power, and it's their job to protect the citizens. And it's a little different to me. Tell me what you think, Matt. I think it's different from saying, we got a mayor, we got a governor, we got somebody. They made the wrong decision. They sent in the National Guard and they shouldn't have, or they didn't, or policy issues. This is different. This is just like, you know, let's just stand back. Let's just watch as people march into a police station and set it on fire with officers in it. And then when the officers get out, my command to the officer is, yeah, just get in the car and back away.
I think you hit on something, both of you there. It's a reluctance to exercise authority. And I mean, I could take it immediately to Chicago, but we could take it also to New York, San Francisco, Philadelphia, New Orleans, and a whole bunch of places. There, you know, the roots of that tendency we could speculate about. I often end up bringing it back to the way that higher education has changed now. Will can probably speak to that with more knowledge than me, but I mean, we see it. You know, I believe a lot of this started with the French deconstructionists, you know, but it's just, this is inculcated into the mindset of the people who are now the mayors and now the prosecutors. You look at the stuff they studied, the stuff they heard in political science and sociology and cultural anthropology and the humanities, and if they're lucky, even in their science classes, you know, they just heard about oppressed classes. But what it boiled down to was anyone who wanted to make a claim of oppression, even somebody who was 1/116th Native American, it was just like, oh, whoa, okay, you're claiming to be oppressed. I got to give you space. I got to give you a platform. And so we let go of our cities, and we still haven't really reclaimed them. So it's a big problem.
Quickly, one thing that's interesting there about all these philosophies is that they're entirely externally driven, right? So the idea is that people do bad things because there are external forces out there that make them do bad things. So we can't have a criminal justice system really as long as there's racism, because there's going to be a disproportionate impact on Black people, for example. And what this completely ignores is the role of the internal. Like 98% of Black people don't commit felony crimes. Those that do are committing those crimes against other Black people. But even beyond that, even if you feel this sort of stupid, sensitive way toward Black criminals, you have to understand that disproportion in America these days ain't that big. So what, 60, 70% of criminals are just white and Spanish guys. So if you get rid of the law, what happens is that anyone who wants to take from the weak can. So that basic reality that life is imperfect and you need rules is extremely obvious. But yeah, there are entire systems of modern qualitative sociology that are set up to teach the opposite, where the idea is that people commit crimes because they don't trust the system. So if you pull back the police and show that the system is just, crime will end. And personally, I mean, even for me, like if you pulled back the police when I was like a skateboarding, brawling kid at like 15 or 16, my reaction would be, okay, now I can do whatever I want. Like most people that are, most armed robbers aren't like deep theoretical analysts of the world. They just want some money in a bag.
Yep, they see an opportunity. I was gonna say, you want to add something before we get to Chicago, Shamika?
Yeah, I have a question. I've been wanting to know what allowed them to set these places up. Like, why were they protected? Why did it seem like no one came in and like, no, get your stuff out the street? I mean, I just don't understand how they were allowed to do that.
Well, you know, it's Seattle. Gosh, how can I answer that succinctly? I just think there was a long-standing left-leaning mindset among elected officials that grievance equaled justification. And I'm not putting it very, very well, but that's really what was going on. Someone with a grievance is someone who must be almost exalted and given special treatment. The whole social justice ethos, because if you didn't honor the grievance, you run the risk of being called racist or classist or engaging in some other kind of ism. In Chicago, they drew up the bridges over the Chicago River in August of 2020. Now, mind you, May 31st, a few days after George Floyd, 18 people were killed in one day here. In July, 106 people were killed. That's more, yes, 2020. It was just mind-boggling. You had people talking about how this was worse than a third world country. In fact, the brother of two victims, the brother lived on Vancouver Island as a school teacher. He was married to a Salvadoran woman, and he was quoted in the Sun-Times saying, "My wife talks about third world countries a lot. Nothing, and I've been there to El Salvador, nothing I saw there is like what's going on the South Side right now." His two brothers were shot randomly at 95th and Stony in the aftermath of George Floyd. People were going into like cell phone stores where a line of people were waiting to pay their bill and randomly shooting. Young father died. The Sun-Times took an inventory that I used and gave them credit for in my book of the 18 people killed on May 31st. And so many of them were like strivers, right? Black strivers, people from the hood, one visiting back from DC, back in Englewood. This stuff was just entirely tragic. And we let it all go. And you had someone from BLM Chicago, after the looting started real bad in August, saying to the media, "Oh, well, if people have to loot, they have to loot. If this is how you're going to put bread on the table, fine." And then the bridges, Shamika and Chicago, the Chicago River, there's like many, many bridges over it so people can get in and out of downtown, right? And so the police and the mayor gave up to a lot of Chicagoans when they saw those bridges raised, right, to stop people from coming on to Michigan Avenue and doing more window smashing and looting. When we saw those bridges raised, that's when I decided to come back to Chicago.
Wow. That is crazy. And the 18 in one day, I forgot about that. I remember the 100 or so in July. But here's another thing, because I want to talk about Chicago, and then I want to talk about where these problems were similar and where they're different. And one thing that's interesting, and it's not the whitest town in the country, obviously, but Seattle's not New York and Chicago, right? So when you talk about the buildup, the May Day stuff, the 1990s to early 2000s, what was going on there? You talk about leadership kind of leaning into this social justice belief, but what are the neighborhood makeups like? I mean, it's not like, like Chicago, it's distinct, right? So you got to say, what the South Side, what the West Side are like. When you put those bridges up, we know exactly what the reasons are, right? We're keeping them over there. You can't make your way to this part of town. But Seattle's not really like that. Not different in size, different in ethnic makeup. So what was the beef in Seattle?
I think it was, there's a history there. The International Workers of the World, right? The IWW, the Wobblies, as they called them back, way early in the 19th century. There was a history in both Seattle and Chicago of violent protest in the early part of the 1900s, in which, and Seattle had its own version of that, in which organized labor was central to that violence. So there was a long-standing radical tradition of protest. Now, was it something in the water, something in the air? I can't say that for sure, but it was part of the place's history. And then I can't tell you exactly how the Black Bloc in Eugene, Oregon got started, but they had a very profound influence on events in Seattle in 99 at WTO and in the first decade of the 2000s. There was just this thing, man. And here, look at Portland in 2020, right? No
That's true.
coincidence. They rioted for 100 days.
Yeah.
They had Antifa there with a table full of literature, how to kill a cop. And the New York Times wrote about this. I footnoted it and referred to it in my book. They were just off the chain completely. They went to the police union office and smashed the windows and set a fire. They went to the mayor's house. And these kinds of personal confrontations are not unknown these days, but I mean, they were more strident about that than a lot of protesters. So the Pacific Northwest, and I will tell you, when weird shit's not going down, it's a great place to live, and downtown Seattle right now is a no-go zone, right? So every summer now, I spend 9 months of the year in Chicago for work, and then I keep working, but I do it full-time remote from Seattle, and I go back. We have a house there, and, hiking on the weekend with my wife, looking out down my street at Puget Sound and the Olympic Mountains. It is utterly, utterly gorgeous. It's beautiful. It's a nice city. Now, you couldn't get a cop to come to your neighborhood anymore. So there's a little dark side beneath all of that. No one wants to be police there anymore, just like in Chicago. So we got some problems, but it's a pretty mellow, nice place until like stuff gets set loose. Then when it gets set loose, the gremlins come out of the corner, I guess is how I'd answer you.
So what is the tourism like? What is the market, going to Pikes and all that in that area?
Yeah.
What is that like now?
I got to tell you, downtown is like a no-go zone. I mean, they are passing out anal injection devices for addicts who have this was in the paper.
Sorry, Shamika's
There's a nonprofit that was proudly claiming the mantle. We are passing out anal injection devices for users who don't have any other veins left. But it's not just the drug problem and the homeless, although downtown, that is a very huge part of it. There's a violence problem now in Seattle, and there have been spates of gang rivals killing each other. The Wall Street Journal sent one of their reporters there within the last year, did a great in-depth piece about Seattle grappling with this murderous violence on its streets. But mainly, you don't go downtown because it's just so unpleasant. I mean, there's
dirty and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, I don't even want to talk. There's, all kinds of human effluent on the sidewalk. There's large homeless camps. There's people, hardcore addiction problems. And for years, they've been spending hundreds of millions of dollars on this, and it only gets worse. So this is part of we've all been thinking a lot about the elections. People like to feel good about themselves. So if you can help engineer a county-wide effort to spend a couple of $100 million on the homeless, it doesn't really matter in the end, sadly, if you improve their lot or not. Just like we don't, some of us at least, don't really think about facts and logic and public policy, right? You take the red pill or the blue pill, basically, and you just go in there, effectively yank the lever, even though you may be doing it, by mail. And my wife pointed out, she follows a lot of this stuff. There's a difference between votes and ballots. And so candidates can go out there and talk about issues and try to get votes. But what the Democrats are doing now is almost mechanized procedure, and it's very hard to prove. So you're not going to find me joining the camp of the so-called deniers. I'm a journalist. I need to see proof. But there is ballot harvesting going on among one of the socialist city council members in Seattle. There may be illegitimate ballot harvesting going on now. Who is really checking the voter rolls for irregularities, right? People who have moved may still receive ballots, right? There's a whole variety of situations where ballots may be put out there with no valid signers of those ballots, but somehow they get processed as legit, even if they're not. So people do all these things because it's like a religion, I think.
One last question, and then I'll go to Shamika and Will, and then we'll go about to Chicago. But I do a survey. We talk a lot about homeless and how it's gotten out of control in a lot of cities. So I always got to ask, because I haven't been to Seattle in several years. So tent or no tent? Do they allow tents in Seattle?
Yes. Now they move people around. So they have this thing where, okay, for a couple of months, you're going to see the main downtown homeless encampment in this one particular spot just south of Chinatown and just east of I-5. And I'm actually recalling that exactly from memory. And, there's always a big drug scene attendant to these big homeless camps, not surprisingly. Then you'll be back a week later and all of a sudden it's completely gone. And you're like, oh, wow, maybe they got their program together. But then you see it all somewhere else, a mile away. So they just shifted around basically. Okay. And yeah.
It's interesting to me because for some reason, with all their problems, New York is the only place that seems to be consistently, DC, Chicago, even though Chicago kind of hides it on Lower Wacker and up on Montrose or whatever in the viaducts, but it's not as visible as DC and the other areas. But everybody else has tents. San Diego, San Francisco, New York, for their records, they say no tents. You can sleep on the streets, you can sleep in the doorway, they can sleep in my house legally. Police wouldn't come and stop them, but they can't sleep on the street in a tent. So I just have to ask. So Seattle's another tent city. Shamika.
I'm still trying to get over the fact that you gotta want to get real high to take a needle in your ass.
Well, they don't have veins. I mean, they water veins out everywhere else. I don't have a lot of. Go quit.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot of childhood memories, but I'm still traumatized from a rectal thermometer. I just don't. I must be out of the loop. Like I find something new out every Thursday. This is crazy.
This is the great part about Cut the Bull.
I know. I tell you, in some Seattle innovates, man. Starbucks, Boeing, Amazon, and anal injection device. But getting halfway more serious about that, Shamika, if you went up the road to Vancouver around 2005, and there's another awesome city, by the way, but it's got its issues too of the same sort. You would have seen them pioneering a thing I know you all have heard of called harm reduction, where they basically maintain on the public dime addicts, hardcore addicts. It was opioid addicts. Now it's and so they have rooms, right? So it started with clean needle programs, and that was the original controversy, right? Clean needles, because, you might get hepatitis or AIDS even from shared needles, which guys on the street would do. So, okay, there's a legit debate over all that, but what the conservative argument against that was as well. Okay, so eventually then what? Do you just keep doing that and keep patting yourself on the back for harm reduction, or do you get them off it? And there was always some lip service to transition away from addiction, but it turned out to be, in too many cases, the sustaining of addiction. So that's part of this super duper progressive Northwest, Pacific Northwest, sort of like socio-political ethos, if you will. So Portland, Seattle, Vancouver, obviously San Francisco further down the coast. And I saw the homeless encampments in San Diego, Will, and I was just flipped out. This was when maybe 2016, and it just went on and on and on and on. It was like another city.
Yep. People didn't know about that. When I went to San Diego, it was before that. And people looked at me like I was crazy when I talked about it. I said, non-savage, this was probably 14. We stayed at the W, and San Diego was a really cool town. The problem with it was it was so bad. The stench of every place around. You walk out you people walk into the hotel and open the door in the hotel lobby, and the hotel lobby smelled like urine and poop. I mean, it was like because it's a lone viaduct. What'd you say, Shamika?
I feel like that when I go to LA. It's like as soon as I step out of the airport, I just smell piss.
That's a lot of big cities, honestly. Like everything just smells like weed and piss. I mean, when I was walking around in New York, it was literally every door frame. And I mean, I make fun of New Yorkers, but Chicago's not much cleaner. And I mean, it's just
Yeah.
it's if you can't maintain civilization, that's what happens. If you take away the public latrines and porta potties because college couples are fucking in them and homeless people are sleeping in them, and then you legalize weed, at least at that NYC level where you've got guys selling it on the table outside every bodega,
Every bodega.
then you're going to have those problems. Like you need to actually enforce the law. And there's this, again, this gets back to Matt's core point, which is that if you lack that social confidence in your society to enforce the law, are we the good guys? Do we even deserve to stop women of, our terrible social class and race from being raped by lunatics? Once you get into that mold, it's very hard to make anything work. The city that I've seen that was the most extreme with this actually. What's up?
I was going to say, they probably will say you should stop them, but first you need to ask them, how they're feeling, why they're doing it, and what their pronouns are.
Well, I think in some ways.
Yeah, and I mean, my personal reaction would be if you're actually talking about like homeless, drug addicted rapists, just kill them. I mean, if you're talking about a capital crime that people are committing against taxpaying citizens, go through a fair legal procedure and then carry out that sentence. I'm obviously not saying do the Brazilian thing where you go through the favelas with machine guns, but just like if you have a criminal justice system and people are committing crimes like rape or murder or throwing old Asian ladies onto the train track, you give them their fair day in court and then you kill them or you throw them in jail for the rest of their lives. And that's how you keep peace and order, the two foundations of civilization. There's probably no ultimate right or wrong at all. But if we're going to pretend there is, and I'm going to constrain my own predatory instincts, I want to be able to walk down the street without seeing people shit on it. It's a perfectly reasonable, perfectly logical demand to make. So cities can either do that, and there are a large number of cities that do, from, Boise at the small end to Miami at the upper end, or you don't. And what you see when you don't is that people just leave. Like last sentence, but we talk about like white flight, middle class, black flight in the 60s like it was magic. Like for some reason, the two races just couldn't stand each other anymore. Violence broke out. People started leaving. No, crime increased 500%. There were giant riots every single year from the year Martin Luther King died to like 1976, the bicentennial year. And by that point, redlining was largely over. Anyone that could moved out to the suburbs. That's what happened.
I'm going to start, at this point. My new thing is that whenever Will, sometimes me, but definitely when Will and Shamika, brings the illuminating, very unique insight, I'm going to pause to say, this is why you should subscribe. You should share these shows with everybody, because the guests are always like, I love this, but man, what do I get interviewed all the time. I never get this. Matt, you were going to say something.
This goes to a couple of things. I mean, it goes to deterrence and enforcement, right? And I noticed there's a thread of violence against women without consequences. Women getting raped on CTA trains in Chicago, arrest rates of, maybe 10 or 15% for criminal sexual assault in Chicago, arrest rates of 7% for carjacking. And we hear that, the community does not trust police. The police will have to perform better on meeting the conditions of the consent decree handed down at the end of the Obama years to the Chicago Police Department. They will have to comply with more paragraphs of instructional prose. And you know why people are not coming forward to identify criminals, people who have witnessed crimes, including victims? They are afraid of getting murdered by the perpetrators.
Yep.
And I regularly link to articles describing that when I'm talking about the low clearance rates. The other thing, Will, that you were talking about really struck a chord with me, this treating of middle-class flight as though it had to be inherently race-driven. So I agree that is, the show is called Cut the Bull, right? I agree that so often is bull. We had something happen here in January of this year that was striking to me. two Black women, one in their 40s, one in her late 20s, pregnant, both of them mothers. The first one, a mother of 6. They were both hairdressers. They were both murdered in separate incidents in January of this year in Chicago on the South Side. Then a day later, Tony Preckwinkle, the Cook County Board chairman, a longtime old lion of progressivism here, was asked about the murder of the 40-year-old woman named Tamiko Talbert, beautiful Black woman, mother of 6, up at 5 a.m. to handle an early bird appointment, right? Living the dream, working hard, murdered for no reason. Tony Preckwinkle, the county board chairman, says, oh, well, you know, this stuff happens because of historic disinvestment in our communities. And I went, oh, shoot me now. The reason you have had historic disinvestment is precisely because of stuff like this. And furthermore, there was no sign in this specific case that there was an economic motive. The guy shot this woman getting out of her car at 5 a.m. and drove on down the street. So, you know, they throw this stuff out like, oh, inflation, no, not our fault. Yeah, you know, it just, they double down on denial, and voters now clearly go for it in most places. And, you know, this sells big time.
Pardon me for getting on my soapbox, but you know, one of the things that bothers me most is that people do crimes because they're poor. You mentioned earlier that the people spinning around in the cars, 3 people got shot during that. I don't think they were there because they were trying to find a way to feed their family. It was a thrill thing. Wasn't there just 18 people shot in one shooting, 2 weeks ago or something?
14 on the west side. Fortunately, nobody killed. A big mass shooting, and they were all gathered to mourn a community elder who had just passed away.
So there was no robbery there, right? That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And then you got so they keep saying that this is the reason. It's either racism or it's an economic. You know about this, obviously. I don't think you were there at the time because this was before 2020. But they used to have this thing. I'm sure it's common in big cities, but in Chicago it was known. It had a name. People from the South and West Side, because you want to go where the money is if you rob them. They used to go apple picking, right? So they would just go to Michigan Avenue, the Gold Coast, looking for people with iPhones so they could snatch their phones.
Oh,
right?
Apple picking.
Yeah, they were going apple picking. So this is just a thing. It's a thing that, you know, kind of like planking and all that stuff. We see other people doing it, so we're just all going to do it, right? You know, in New York, it was push people on a train, or just a woman walking down this train stairs to go to the subway. They would just punch them. For like 3 months, women were getting punched. They weren't robbing them. They weren't even sexually assaulting them. This is just cultural riot. It has nothing to do with economics, right? And so they just keep saying that this is the reason why. This is not the reason why people do bad stuff. They do bad stuff because they're bad. They do it because it's a trend. They do it because they think it's funny. They're not doing it because, you know, how else am I going to eat if I don't punch a random woman
to jump
in the face?
in very briefly there. I mean, Charles just said something that's really deep and obvious. People do bad things because they're bad. Human beings are members of a predator species. Like, all of science and all of religion, to some extent, is focused on, as human science, is focused on trying to manage this fact. So why do young male warriors fight? Because they like to. If you know anything about the fraternity scene or the rave scene, crime rates there are as high as they are in the hood. They're just prosecuted less often, and it's considered ungentlemanly to kill. So you don't really have as many bodies to clean up. But this is just a reality to some extent. So, like, that's point one. Point one is there's always going to be crime. Certain things like rape have almost no connection to social class. Point two is, yeah, sure, we all oppose racism and classism. That plays some role when you look at, for example, particularly the West Side. Okay, let's help. But point three is that we regularly see these 1,000% increases in crime that are caused by dumbass, usually liberal social policy, like letting people build tent cities downtown. And it's foolish to ignore that. It's foolish to pretend that's economic. Since the start of Black Lives Matter, I mean, in 2014, this is something I know professionally, we had, 14,194 murders. We're now averaging about 22,000 more murders per year. And this is despite quarantine. A lot of people still sitting at home. That's because the police pulled back in big cities because they felt guilty about arresting blacks. Now there's some dead poor whites and Italians and Hispanics too, but like 80% of the new murder victims are black. We now make up the majority of murder victims. Because if you stop enforcing the law, people will commit crimes. This is all stuff that on any golf course, on any basketball court, any barbershop, anyone who's not an idiot understands. You have to be very well educated not to get this. If you stop locking up goons in neighborhoods, be they black, Italian, Mexican, whatever, there's going to be more violence in those neighborhoods.
And I just would like to end with, when they caught the guy, I'll get to you in a minute, because last thing, when they caught the group of people who were going around snatching stuff from people on the street, they were driving, it wasn't stolen, an Audi A7 SUV. Shamika, to you.
What? So this is a random question. So if humans are predatory in nature, I would say men prey on women for sex. Does that mean women would prey on men for the same thing, or something different if we're all predators?
If you're actually, like, if you read Evo Psych, women generally prey on men for money, mental manipulation. It's different stuff.
But
and
the preying is the same. It's just how they do it is differently, right? So if they could prey like a lion fight to take over the pride, they would, but that's not how they win. So they prey in a way that they can take advantage, right?
Yeah, I think that's correct. I mean, so like there's actually a lot of writing about human evil. I mean, going back scientifically, at least to Hannah Arendt, and how banal it is and how common it is. So, I mean, like the majority of poisoners are women. Like the majority of people who will knock out like a daughter's athletic rival basically by killing them. You know, try these pills. Those are females. The majority of people will do things like cut someone's dick off while they're asleep. Those are females. When you get into like the brutal, like, let's knuckle up, buddy stuff, that's men. Like guns, that kind of thing, mostly male. But the urge to hurt your opponent doesn't seem to vary much between men and women.
Right.
Well,
Matt,
and
we didn't forget about you.
No. I wanted to add, number one, we have lady thugs though in our big cities now.
Oh, yeah.
Y'all know that, and they're doing the organized retail crime. Some of them are doing the hardcore stuff with guns and killing. So that's a thing too. But, you know, this comes back in the end to how do we solve this? And I think most people that are most affected, and 80% of murder victims in Chicago are black, by the way, every year now, every year.
Yeah.
Last time they were able to assess the racial breakdown of murder perpetrators in Chicago, they looked at 21 years worth of data. That ended in 2011. But the known perpetrators, which of course is a subset of all, right? Because they don't catch very many. Known perpetrators were 70 to 80% black each year. Latinos were about 15%, which tracked with their victim rates too. But here now, most people have decided to take it into their own hands. Why do I say that? Well, I had a look at, and this won't surprise you guys, but I had a look at voter turnout in Chicago for 2 days ago, right? On election day. So we had 41.5% of our electorate turn out to vote for instance, legislators who recently approved one of the worst criminal justice reform bills in the entire nation.
The Safety Act?
The Safety Act, very ironically
named.
Can you tell
them what the Safety Act is?
Well, it has some things in it that people don't totally hate, like more body cameras for police. It has an online database, so you can look up whether this policeman or that one has been decertified. I think that's fine. Mm-hmm. They should also have sentencing information by judge and courtroom online. Somehow they didn't think to put that in the bill, but the big things the Safety Act does is it erases cash bail, abolishes it as of January 1st. Most of it's already in effect. It also is going to make pretrial detention of hardcore dudes much harder. It's basically going to remove pretrial detention for a whole lot of guys, even if they have prior felony convictions, and even if they've now been charged with a serious new crime. In addition, if a guy tears off his ankle bracelet, now under the Safety Act, he gets a 48-hour head start. The police cannot go looking for him for 48 hours. They also get 2 8-hour essential movement breaks during the week. Now, a guy on electronic monitoring these days in Cook County, 75% of that population is looking at a trial for a violent or weapons charge. Very often they have prior felony convictions for violent or weapons crimes, but they're not detained before trial, even on a new charge, and they get 2 8-hour breaks. Now, if this stuff were closely supervised, okay, right? Go see a job counselor, go to church, whatever. But it's not closely supervised. They don't have enough guys to watch over these fellows. And so what might they do? They might go out and shoot or intimidate a witness, right? So that is one more, couple more things the Safety Act does. It also makes it harder for cops to arrest and take into custody a trespasser. There might be some fixes before the election. The Democratic governor said, we'll get to it after the election. Now, Democrats have consolidated their hold on power in Illinois. This is the bluest of blue states. They increased their super majorities in the state house and the state senate. So there is a bill drafted by a Democratic state senator who used to be a prosecutor to fix some of the problems. But there's no political pressure to really do much. So the Safety Act in Illinois is kind of like the embodiment. It's like George Soros took his pen to paper. And this is in a state where your largest city and your largest metro region, right? 8 million people in metro Chicago, that crime is very bad and it's spreading outside of the city. So this is one of the most irresponsible things ever done. And Illinois is like, we're the lab rats.
Right. So I want to know what people are saying, and you do a great job of telling stories. And in your book, What's Next, you interview some people and you get kind of the pulse of what people are thinking. You just mentioned there was just an election a couple of days ago. So talk a bit about that. I mean, you alluded earlier to what some of the things we may have to do to change. But what are people saying? Obviously, they're fed up with it. But what are they saying? What are they upset about? The Democrats increased their majority, so it may not be playing itself out electorally, but they must be thinking something. What are people telling you about the crime and about, the politics and inflation and everything? What are they saying?
Oh, and crime is kind of the thing chewing the scenery here, but I hear a lot about inflation too. I'm hearing different things. One, especially from suburban white conservatives, is if you haven't already moved to Florida or Tennessee or someplace like that, you're a fool. Do it. Or I'm going now. I know people in the city, though, and this is an interesting story that is not much told, and I hope to do some more storytelling about this at Wirepoints, where I work full-time as senior editor. There are people who are committed to staying, who want to keep doing good works. I know this cat who looks like Tony Soprano, right? I went to high school with him. Yeah, he speaks Mandarin. He's a surprising dude, and he acts when he's not running his construction company. He acts in these kind of black gangster movies that a guy from Inglewood named Billy Ray Valentine makes. It's kind of cool. Well, Rich used to run track in the Big Ten, and a few years ago, he started a track club for at-risk youth in Inglewood, which you all probably know is one of the more tough and high-risk, high-crime neighborhoods. I talked to him the other day. He's like, I'm not going anywhere, man. And there's a bunch of us. We're going to keep doing what we do. You can't give up on this city, man. And, that was the kind of thinking that brought me back here and has kept me here. So I hear stuff like that. But what I hear is grief. And I hear dismay around parenting, family solidarity.
Mm-hmm.
I have talked to people who have told me stories. I could give you one or two examples, but I think I've just said a lot. So there is a lot of awareness of where parents are falling short and how it is that the predatory young men become that way through a kind of a system of neglect.
Well, since we talked about, we're getting close to the end, we talked about Seattle, we talked about Chicago and your unique closeness to both. Maybe we should end with, from the book, you telling the story of being in Seattle, going to Chicago because you saw what was happening in the town you grew up in, wanting to write about it, and then the perfect example of what was going to be in front of you in the weeks coming forth. I think you picked a neighborhood to stay in, and you talked about something that happened in that neighborhood the first or second night you were in town.
Yeah, so I moved into Bridgeport, right? October 31st. First thing I did actually was go down to the nonprofit and church run by a great man named Reverend Corey Brooks, who I think some of you know or have heard of. And so that there's some stories tied to that. But then, like a day after the election was called for Biden over Trump, right? So I'm living in Bridgeport for 6 weeks, where all the Irish mayors came from. Nice street, right down the block from St. Mary of Perpetual Help, this beautiful church built in 1855 in the Polish cathedral style. I looked that up. It's a real beauty. Weathered bronze dome, green, all of that. So I come out one day, I'm walking to Mariano's on Archer Avenue to get groceries, and I see these police cars like parked at an angle at the backside of the church. And I get up there and I see what has happened. This is day after they called the election for Biden. The church has been vandalized. So there's a white alabaster statue of St. Mary, painted with pink and black spray paint, Biden's name and an anarchist symbol. And of course, Joe Biden had nothing to do with this. These were just, pea-brained vandals. Then the walls of the church parish building spray painted, and it says, "No gods, no gods." They wanted to diss religion, right? So I'm there, and I'm talking to a cop. And he comes out of his car and he wants to commiserate. And it turns out he was baptized in that church, right? And I'm just thinking about everything. I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking about the gunshots in the night in this safe neighborhood that's now kind of upscale and filled with hipsters. I'm thinking about being downtown and seeing a live blues concert, and the city looks beautiful and great. But it turns out that weekend, 55 people were shot and 9 killed. And that was a pretty good weekend. So I'm thinking about all this stuff, and it just kind of hits me, we're kind of right at the crux of the moment right here, and things are becoming normalized, right? And so the weekly body count, the number shot, the number wounded, this is a thing now, right? And every Monday, the mayor and the police chief in 2022 get up there and they say murders are down, shootings are down, but they're comparing that to 2021. So, I mean, there was just a lot of stuff hitting me right then. But what I took away from it, I thought I kind of tied it back to Seattle, Charles, and I'll wrap this up. When you're hiking in the mountains, sometimes you have to make what's called a crux move, right? That's when you come to a real dangerous spot. If you slip and fall, it could be curtains. And you take your time. You take your time, you look around, you consider the environment and the conditions before you take your next step. And then you get through it safely. And it hit me after all of this stuff was kind of soaking in. All this stuff that I just described and a lot more else, it kind of hit me that Chicago is in a position now where it has to make a lot of crux moves. The path is very dangerous. There's a sharp fall coming if we misstep. The right steps are all the things we've talked about, not tolerating violence, not tolerating sociopathy. So it hit me that this whole next decade has to be a decade of crux moves for cities like Chicago. But if we keep electing the same types of fools who are running these cities now, we're done. We're going to fall right off that mountain. So that was kind of my my moment of light there for a hot minute.
Well, I mean, I love the work that you do, and I hope you keep writing and exposing and telling the great stories that help people draw a picture, right? Of what's going on that people can understand. And I guess it's good that you kind of ended on a positive, that you have a group of friends and people you talk to that say, regardless of what's happening, even with the election and the strength of one party, the one party rule, they're staying and they're going to keep doing what they're doing. So hopefully that will be the beginning of some sort of that crux move you say that it needed in Chicago and in Seattle and in the country. He is Matt Rosenberg, senior editor at Wirepoints and the author of What Next Chicago? Notes of a Pissed Off Native Son. Matt, thank you for joining us.
It was a pleasure. Great to be with all of you. Thank you.
From you commies who know you can't fuck with me. I got a country to save. God bless the US of A. Land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to save, cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving the day.